Peak Human.
Les humains à leur meilleur.
C'est tu apogeo.
Peak 人間
Peak Human.
Sally Norton has a degree in nutrition from Cornell University and a master's of public health from the University of North Carolina. She managed a 5-year National Institute of Health funded program at the UNC Medical School. She's a nutrition consultant, speaker, and an all-around oxalate expert. This is a sad story with a happy ending. Sally's life goal from age 5 was to study nutrition and help people be healthy. She followed all the traditional advice and ate a very plant-heavy vegetarian and even vegan diet, only to have 30 years of health problems because of that diet. At first, all this oxalate stuff is hard to believe. It's talked about so little and there's not a lot of mainstream knowledge on it in the medical community. We talk some real science a little ways into the episode, so know it's coming. Also, for people who may be skeptical of how bad oxalates are, you can go to the vegan site veganhealth.org/oxalate and see the comprehensive, mile-long list of problems and warnings about oxalates. Yes, a vegan site warning about plant food dangers. This is not some wacky carnivore idea, people. I just started a Patreon for this podcast. I really want to keep this ad-free, and I'm getting multiple offers for sponsorships. This is a huge amount of work I do completely on my own, and I don't think I have the bandwidth to keep it up much longer. I'll spare you the details of how many hours it takes me weekly to put it out, but just know it's way more than you think. I'll continue keeping this a high quality, and from what I've heard, valuable resource for people if I can get the support of the community. We are a tribe, and everyone does their part to keep things moving. I appreciate all the messages I get that help keep me motivated when the hours get long. Even people's suggestions on guests really help. This episode was possible from 1 or 2 listeners who kept mentioning Sally and her work. Thanks so much for supporting me in all my efforts. This will allow me to keep putting out content on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube as well. Please go to patreon.com/peakhuman or click through the link in the show notes and become a member of the tribe there. Just a couple dollars a month really helps. You can also get more perks like extended show notes and bonus content we're just beginning to put out, or an invite to the private Slack group. That's patreon.com/peakhuman. Thanks in advance, and here's Sally Norton. Yes, we finally did it. We're live. Sally, thank you so much for coming on. I've been deep diving into all your awesome information, and it's so cool to talk to you today.
It's wonderful to talk to you. I'm glad for your interest.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's kind of a big story here is why aren't more people interested in oxalates? And it's kind of what we're going to talk about today. So why did you start studying oxalates? Why should we listen to you?
Well, according to some people, my biggest credential is my personal journey that got me here and the journey of undoing the damage that oxalates have done to my health. I am a lifelong nutrition geek. I was already running home from kindergarten telling my mother whatever they taught us that was like what we're supposed to eat. Mm-hmm. And in 7th grade, my science teacher showed us a film strip, and it was a nutrition film strip, and it had, picture. Of course, people now don't know what that is, but anyway, it's a series of still pictures. Mm-hmm. And it said, if you eat all this cabbage stuff, you can prevent cancer. And if you eat all these hot dogs and junk food, you'll get cancer. And to me, I thought, oh my gosh, that is so cool that you could have a lifestyle and a nutrition approach and select whether or not you're going to have a crummy, disease-filled life or have a productive, happy life that's free of disease. I'm like, who wouldn't want to know that? Mm-hmm. So I decided within a day of that film strip that I would get a degree in nutrition. Basically, without having the terminology at age 12 or 13, I wanted to be in the wellness, promotion, health education, nutrition business from the get-go, just in case anyone else cared about avoiding illness. And so I, in 10th grade, decided Cornell was the place to go, one of the best nutrition schools on the East Coast. It was in my state. And I did that. And then I decided I needed a degree in public health because I thought I needed to understand human behavior and policy and the wider environment that affects our lifestyle and our food choices. I knew nothing about oxalates. My textbook at Cornell that could have covered it had 2 different chapters with each had about 1 inch of text. This is a column that's 2.5 inches wide or 2 inches wide. About oxalate, there is very little awareness of the effects of oxalate that we're eating in our diet. And so we're forgetting to even look at it. So it took me 30 years of health problems and getting to the point where my whole career and ability to live my life had pretty much come to a halt. And the slow climb through what little information and what few diets I hadn't already tried, thanks to, a few things, I was able to finally see that oxalates were an issue, connecting to a lifetime of arthritis, and then it goes on from there. But my qualifications are I've always wanted to be healthy. I've done all the right things to be healthy. I've tried all the right things. I've done the vegetarian thing, the vegan thing, the this, the that, the locally this, and none of it worked until I found oxalate at age almost 50.
Wow. Yeah. And you started very plant-based side, right?
After high school, it might have been the summer between high school and my first year in college, I read Francis Moore Lepay's book, Diet for a Small Planet.
I've brought that up multiple times.
That got me going. And for my generation, I think that was one of the major entry points. And so I did 8 years of that, and I was very committed and subscribed to Vegetarian Journal and ordered the book at a time when I had no money to do so, but ordered the book the first chance you could get the paperback version of John Robbins' book, Diet for a New America. And that book quickly convinced me that all milk was pus and even eggs were horrible and you must be vegan. And I did that. And within 3 months, my knees were hurting and I could hardly go up and down stairs, but I never connected that. I also got pneumonia 3 times over. I was going through a divorce, so I was extremely stressed and trying to get my career established at the same time. So I just assumed that all that pneumonia and whatever was stress and never connected it to having gone to a vegan diet.
So we're going to get into these details later, but it seems like a lot of people may have the same problems where you're trying to be healthy. The foods that you think are healthy are actually causing problems and you don't know it till a long time in the future. And so that you were trying to be healthy, all throughout growing up. And that's what you attribute to your oxalate problems too.
Yeah, I do.
Well, let's get into it then, because you published a great paper too. I was reading that called The Lost Seasonality and Overconsumption of Plants, Risking Oxalate Toxicity. And it's all eye-opening. I saw your presentation. I've heard you on other shows. So why don't more people know about this? That's my biggest question. It's now that I've dove in and looked at all this, I'm like, okay, so why don't more people know about oxalate?
That was my question. Here I have a degree from an Ivy League institution in nutrition and a public health degree. I'm super connected to medical people and holistic healers and know all this stuff. I'm teaching holistic healing and I'm supposed to know all this stuff. How come I don't know anything? How did I get myself in trouble with oxalate? How could this, I was completely knocked over by it. And so it took me a while to think I know the answer to that. And clearly what's so is that it's an ignored topic in science. And this is not the only topic that got dropped in science because some other big fad comes along. If you think about the war on cancer, we put a lot of research into cancer for a while, and that was the big thing. And then it was soluble fiber was the big thing. And now it's the microbiome and the genome. And so an awful lot of talent and energy research-wise goes off into these fad directions. So there's some of that. And so when science was really getting to know oxalate, it began in the late 1700s and all through the 1800s, and it started to die off in the early 1900s, the interest in it. And during those years, we never fully understood the meaning of the science we already had, which was quite good. And it didn't fit the predominant narrative that the wider culture has about food, and especially now, it doesn't fit well at all. And so there's the distraction to the other topics. And there hasn't been anyone rising up since about 1850 who was willing to be a champion on the science side, the research side, and on the public education side.
Yeah, sorry, I think you're referring to Dr. Birding, who had...
Golding Bird. Yeah.
Oh, Golding Bird. I put the names together. So yeah, he had some major... Didn't he die of oxalate?
He did at age 39.
So we knew about this back then.
We did. It had a name, the oxalic acid diatheses. And who knew about it was the English, the Scottish, the Irish, the English knew about it. They have a diet that includes 4 cups of tea a day, which is a high oxalate food. A cup of tea is 25 milligrams of oxalate. Potatoes is the common side dish. And then, they tended to have rhubarb in the spring and high oxalate greens in the spring. And so the oxalic diatheses was a seasonal disorder that would show up in the spring. They knew it was diet related. They did connect it to the rhubarb. And it was defined as someone who had digestive trouble, who also showed up with either neurological symptoms, rheumatic issues, or some kind of musculoskeletal pain, and that there was some way to trace a dietary connection to it. And they weren't sure. The testing for foods wasn't all that great at that point in time. I think it was mostly being done in Germany.
Mm-hmm.
And so, of course, back then, most people spoke several languages, and it would be okay if someone was writing and doing the research in German. But see, the Germans and the French didn't necessarily see the diatheses so much because they weren't tea drinkers who had potatoes with every meal. And so, there was a slight bit of a debate about it. The Brits say it exists, but we don't see it so much. And so that already is part of the reason why oxalates have been ignored, because you have to be in the right situation to see something as sneaky and tricky and elusive as oxalate.
Well, so many things you eat, you have no idea which ones are affecting you, especially back then when you couldn't test and look at things under a microscope as well. So the symptoms you're talking about sounds like what some plant-based people get.
Really get,
right?
Big time.
And before we get too far in, we should just mention the high oxalate foods, because you mentioned tea and potatoes, but a lot of the foods that people think are the healthiest have the most oxalates, right? Spinach. What's the list? What's like the top level list?
Yeah, the top ones that are really the thing right now are whole grains. They've been in for 30 years already. But the spinach has had this, renaissance and since the smoothie thing took off about 10 years ago. And, all kinds of people came up with things to blend spinach and other things, and the whole juicing thing took off. So spinach is probably enemy one, because it has this reputation that you cannot insult spinach. After all, a cartoon character says it's good for you.
Popeye, yeah.
Yeah, and the reason Popeye says that is because back then they thought spinach offered a lot of iron. And also back then, though, they were showing that if you fed spinach to rats, they were trying to use spinach as a way to deliver calcium in diets and rat studies. A guy who worked at Campbell's Soup Company was doing this. Because back then, the canned food companies were trying to convince people to buy commercially canned foods instead of relying on their own home canning, which was preferred by most people. And they wanted to demonstrate that it was just as good for you. So they did some tests on the rats using spinach to compensate for calcium. And when they gave the rats the canned food plus the spinach, the rats lost the ability to reproduce and build a full set of strong bones. Their bones were smaller and weaker.
Mm.
And in later tests, when they tried to give the rats just a spinach diet, the rats just died.
Oh my God.
So that demonstrated that the calcium in spinach was not helping the rats grow, develop their gonads, and get their bones sturdy. So it was clear early on, back in the early days of nutrition, that spinach wasn't delivering calcium. We've known that forever, but we've forgotten that. And the same is true of the iron, and the same is true of the folate that's supposed to be there that isn't really, and the lutein. Those things are very perishable. In order for them to be preserved in the spinach, it has to be kept super cold, and that isn't happening in the processing of the cutting and the washing and the trucking and even just getting it from the store to the home. It's not cold enough to retain those nutrients. So these claims on the labels of the spinach bags and online and so on aren't really based on the fact that it's not nutrition that gets into you.
Yeah, that's super surprising. So most people just see USDA data of the nutrients and the vitamins and minerals and assume that that's 100% perfect science.
And what's sad is that dietitians and professors of dietitians just use those numbers to calculate a menu for a sick person or come up with a dietary plan. We're going to get you the RDA in this menu of these nutrients. We're going to use these food tables that never, ever attempted to compensate for bioavailability whatsoever. If you're not talking about bioavailability, what is the point of the chart?
Exactly.
And this is the backbone of nutrition, and it's completely nonsense.
It's insane. I talk about this all the plant foods. We know they don't have the same bioavailability. And yet it's still this is solid science. Yet there's a whole vegan world and plant-based world, and even just normal doctors don't understand this. And now there's all these people like me talking about it, and everyone thinks we're crazy.
Well, it only takes an ounce of logic to recognize the whole reason we're blending spinach the way we are and using juicers and doing smoothies is because eating the whole plant food and chewing it with your teeth doesn't work. And so that in itself is a compensation for the inadequacy of them as a nutrient delivery system. We just can't even admit to ourselves the reason we're juicing is because we can't get enough nutrition.
Yeah, to get the
out of these
volume,
foods.
we'd have to be eating all day. If you're eating like a raw vegan diet, you have to be eating all day to maybe even get enough nutrition. I've talked to a PhD that says it's impossible for humans to get enough nutrition from raw plant foods.
I completely agree with that.
Yeah.
I think it's dangerous, and I think that young people should be warned about this. Their bodies are the ones who are going to carry the next generation. It's criminal to be pregnant and nursing, I think, on such an inadequate diet. How is that kid going to have a chance?
Yeah.
I really worry about it because that's who it's popular with is the young girls. They're told this is the moral way to live. You must be moral. You must not eat animals, even eggs or milk. And they feel guilty and they feel a great burden on themselves that they must try harder to be vegan.
Yeah.
And it's not fair because it's not true.
It's terrible. And I know these people. I know these young women that just recently finally gave that up and realized how terrible it was. But no one cares about their stories. They're just, well, even the popular ones on YouTube, there's some of these going around where these people with millions of subscribers making tons of money recently have been, they found out that they were eating fish and they were exposed. And still the viewers will just be like, oh, they weren't doing it correctly, or they'll always make excuses.
Well, they have used these techniques for 30 years now of seeming to have the moral high ground. And it's very convincing because people don't recognize the lies and manipulation underneath it. It just seems like a safe bet because how could you go wrong in not killing something? It's just way too simplistic. And perhaps that's because we really lack good biology knowledge in our culture. I'm surprised at how many people can have a college degree and not have a biology class in their background. Mm-hmm. Well, personally, if I was king, I would make everyone take the most basic biology class.
Yeah. Well, we should get back on biology. Let's go back to these hard facts. When tested in a lab, spinach, for example, does not have the calcium, the iron, and what else in it?
Folate and lutein. Those are two, I don't remember the name of the authors, but they did a nice paper testing post-harvest spinach and found that some large percentage, at least 25% decline, depending on the amount of time and the temperature, that just to be able to find it in the plant itself. This is not about absorption and whether your body even wants to absorb these things or knows what to do with them, but just the content in the food requires very careful temperature control in order to have those things there. And that's not what's happening.
Well, so even if you go to a farmer's market and you think you're all healthy and awesome, I mean, that still got trucked over.
It did. It was picked last night and it's been sitting out on the stand without ice or refrigeration. I mean, the temperature has to be really cold. We're talking like it has to be 38 degrees or 40, something cold.
Wow. We're
not saying it has to be less than 70 degrees, something you could pull off at a farmer's market on a cool day with a shade, maybe.
Not even close. And then even just the bioavailability in your body. I like what you say. Your body doesn't even know what to do with it. I mean, I'm hearing people talk about plant foods as if they're a different operating system, right? It's like Mac and PC, right? It's like completely right. It's like, what are you trying to put in some like PC program into Mac? It's like, what's going on? We are meant to eat these animal foods and they work with us. They have this extreme bioavailability and plants do not. It's pretty simple.
Unfortunately, people don't know that because they're being manipulated to think that we're really gorillas that are from the trees. And yet some people are like, no, we're not animals. But we are in this niche of being hunters and have been there since before we were fully human. We've been eating meat. That's how we got here. Mm-hmm. And we should be so grateful that the possibility of all we can do with our minds and our bodies comes from the fact that we eat meat.
I completely agree. So I've been having a lot of different kind of guests on my podcast because I'm trying to get all sides of this and not just be super biased and, think one way and try to keep my mind open while I keep the audience's mind open. And then a lot of these people, they're like, oh yeah, we need to make half our plates green and vegetables and all this. And I don't argue with them. I don't bring people on to argue with them. I let them speak their mind. But I don't know, just lately I've been going down this animal foods route where I think this is just the way to eat more and more. And I'm eating less and less plant foods. And it's just making less and less sense to me to even eat them.
It's interesting that we're riding this same journey together, so many of us, without, we never talked about this, but
Yeah.
our bodies, we're finally starting to listen to our bodies instead of theory, I think. Luckily, this carnivore movement has sort of blown the lid off a sort of taboo subject. Like, could you just pile on a huge pile of meat and live on that? Is that okay? That's been so not okay, because I think a couple of things got us really into plants. I have a personal theory. I haven't read this anywhere, but I really think that times of crisis and shortage and starvation, we end up relying on plants to get us through those times. And a big modern cultural event like that was World War I. Things were not good. This was a terrible thing for Western societies in general. And our country, and probably many others, invented the idea of the victory garden. The victory garden is going to help us win the war, defeat the bad guys, bring our precious sons home, the few that are still alive, and restore society to normalcy. If you poor, wringing your hands, lonely women trying to raise your kids, worried about is your man going to come home alive or not, you can get busy in the garden and you can win this war for us by feeding your family plants. And I really think out of basically government propaganda, we made plants a superhero.
Yeah, the shortage of meat, it was expensive. We didn't have much of it. So this was the alternative. This was an idea that we could survive on.
Yep. And, that just, I think at the same time, this is when canned food and processed food was getting started. Crisco was getting started. Like, companies were getting involved in, because manufacturing gets real important during wartime. And so you up your manufacturing technologies and infrastructure. And it could be too that just like after World War II, where we repurposed war machine infrastructure for the production of pesticides, I haven't looked into this is a wild thought, but we may have repurposed some of that wartime infrastructure from World War I into food manufacturing and distribution.
I think we definitely did. And even just like I know like a lot of these technologies for packaging and processing foods were developed for war, for like rations and stuff.
Exactly. So war and bad food seem to go together.
And so America got on this. So I have to tell this story. I was out with a girl last night from Peru, and we talked about nutrition and diet because that's all I talk about. So everyone has to talk about that with me. And she's like, yeah, in Peru, we eat meat and rice and potatoes. Like, it's absurd to eat vegetables. She was like laughing at Americans for eating vegetables. She was like, broccoli, why would I eat this? We would never eat this. I've never known anyone who ate broccoli. We don't eat vegetables. We have meat, seafood. We have a little bit. The only vegetables they eat is we have a little cilantro and onions. Yes, they have like a little bit on the side, a tiny bit as, part of ceviche or part of like a garnish. But their plate is starch and meat. I'm not saying that starch is great for everyone, but that's a whole different story. But they're doing fine without any vegetables. She's like, we don't have heart attacks. We don't have all these different things. Like, we just eat meat.
That's fantastic. There's so much to ask her, and too bad she's not here.
I wanted to do a little podcast with her. We'll see if it happens. I just want to hear this because it makes so much sense when you think about these other countries that aren't in this whole anti-meat world and this whole vegetables are the best things on earth world that America's in, and especially Los Angeles, and especially the mainstream media. You have to shake your head sometimes and be like, wait, why do we think that vegetables are so good? The rest of the world doesn't necessarily think that. Where did we even get this idea from? And I guess, I've had other people talk about, like Dr. Gary Fettke goes in kind of the anti-meat agenda. And there's just a lot to it that
I think it was easy to build on the general thrill of spring and the strawberries coming in or the raspberries coming in, and you can turn that into a dessert, and how those special perishable seasonal foods could be happy memories from childhood, or going to the apple orchard and picking apples. I could see how you would get very attached to like the fruit, especially. And
it's sweet.
The whole idea that you could have these more and more thanks to the growing potential in California. We created the vegetable basket in California and the interstate highway system and refrigeration and 24-hour grocery stores. And we created this whole commercial opportunity to make money and to up our affluence through this. And so it could be that fresh fruits and vegetables got attached to being affluent. And it became, an ambition to be the kind of person who could afford those things and have those pretty shapes and colors in our houses and on our plates. It's all just theory, but I think that kind of buy-in happens at some visceral level. Like, oh, when those strawberries came in and we were walking down the road and we saw those and ate some, that was so good, And so, yeah, you ate 2 strawberries, but now you can buy them every day of the year and they don't even taste good, but we still are attached to the idea of the beautiful strawberry.
Yeah, and there's so much to it. But let's get back into your research and science. So you're mentioning that we only had them some time of the year, and that's huge. So I think one of my big questions after listening to all your stuff is, okay, so then why doesn't everyone have terrible problems because of this oxalate? Right? If it's so bad, then why not? So,
well, what if we do all have terrible problems and we don't even know what real health is like? I mean, disease is not our natural state, and I think we've accepted the degree of pain we're in and disability we're in. It's just, oh, that's just life. Yeah. Maybe not.
Oh, definitely. That's normal.
So if we're not willing to admit that we're not as healthy and happy as we want to be, that we're not aging as well, that we're injury prone, that we get headaches and stomach aches and have aches and pains and can't sleep that well and are grumpy and, can't calm down, can't even meditate because we're jumpy and fundamentally just not right. If we can't admit that we're sick and in pain, then how could we admit that the way we're living isn't working for us?
Mm-hmm.
And do we want to admit that? But if we could consider the fact that we might be more awesome somehow, we could be better, we could age better, we could perform better, we could think better, we could love better, that would be good. And then we'd think about, what causes us to not be awesome? And I think that the 2 answers are toxicity and deficiency.
Mm-hmm.
And plant foods, especially the oxalate in plant foods, creates both. And so, it's beyond, we know that sugars and bad fats and heavy metals and radiation and drug use and alcohol can wear you out and have horrible effects. Mm-hmm. But we don't want to admit that the precious black raspberry is a problem. But, it's time. It's time now to reconsider because we're in a crisis right now. The children aren't healthy. The elderly aren't doing that well. We have mental illness exploding. They're saying, 1 out of every 2 children is on their way to full-blown diabetes. And 1 out of 3 of us is heading for Parkinson's and some sort of mental failure. The amount of back pain, 3/4 of us have back pain, arthritis and aches and pains we don't want to admit to, and other problems we wouldn't admit to, like urinary urgency or having to get up at night and pee. That's not normal. You should be able to sleep through the night. Mm-hmm. If you don't sleep through the night, something's wrong. Mm. And that's a great example of something that oxalates will do to you.
I think I got screwed by oxalates. I got on that whole kale shake, spinach shake for years ago and made them every day for 3 years. And I always have to wake up in the middle of the night to pee. And many other things, little things I've noticed. And I watched in your presentation, you're talking about, so I was wondering, just 2 days ago, I was wondering, why are my fingers peeling? My fingers, all the skin, I was peeling off my fingers. And then it was so crazy today, while I was watching your presentation, you talked about it, that it's your body's getting rid of those oxalates. It's now that I stopped eating spinach and almonds and all these things a couple of weeks ago. And
you're just getting going. Oh, this is fabulous. This is, yeah. We have to talk.
It's real. It wasn't just because I saw your video. I noticed this beforehand. And then I just asked you just before you started, it was my fingers peeling. Does that have anything to do with it? And you're like, yes.
It does. For me, it was my feet peeling like crazy with little red bumps and rashes. And the interesting thing is during this time, my feet were getting better than they'd been in 30 years. So how are your fingers doing? Are you able to type with them and function?
No, they're good. They just were peeling a lot and it's not that bad. But
that's a sign that the body's trying to push the oxalates out. And this happens in waves, in unpredictable waves. For those of us who did things like what you're describing with the almonds and the spinach, for me, it was sweet potatoes and Swiss chard and walnuts, which aren't as bad as almonds. Almonds and peanuts are the worst in terms of bioavailability and levels of oxalate in the nuts. All the nuts are pretty terrible. Anything that's a seed is pretty bad. So it's pretty easy now to go for decades where every day you ate something that was pretty high in oxalate. And so give you a sense, if you had one spinach smoothie that was sort of the classic spinach smoothie that had about 2.5 or 3 cups of spinach and maybe a little dab of almond butter or some almond milk in there, you're at about 1,000 milligrams of oxalate in that shake. And that's at a normal portion that a nutritionist would permit you to have versus, the jumbo. Everyone has these jumbo cups and jumbo blenders now. So you could make mega ones.
Mine are big.
Because you can now buy spinach in like wheelbarrows at Costco and places like that.
Oh, Costco. It's $3.50 for 5 pounds in a bag.
Wow.
It's either 3 pounds or 5 pounds. It's so cheap. Yeah. I used to buy those every week. I think I'm an idiot.
People have told me the reason they go to Costco weekly is to get their weekly spinach.
Yeah. A listener actually suggested it. Multiple listeners wanted me to have you on, and they're like, you're never going to eat spinach again after you took the salad. And I think that's very true. Wait, so, okay, I want to get back to science because a lot of people may think we're talking crazy talk. We're talking about our fingers peeling and like this is all, hokey stuff. There's science. First, let's list the foods.
Okay, the high oxalate foods?
Yes.
The ones you can get in trouble with?
Yes.
Okay, the seed department, chia, poppy, hemp, sesame, and tahini that you make with that. The nuts, the cashews, the pine nuts, the almonds. In the vegetable world, it's the Swiss chard, spinach, beet greens, beets, okra, which hardly anyone eats, sugar snap peas, artichoke heart, sweet potatoes, white potatoes. Now, sweet potatoes, that was my thing. In fact, I did vegetarian for 8 years and then vegan for 8 years, and my health was collapsing when I was in graduate school, and it forced me out of that back into some animal food. And I realized I couldn't do wheat or beans, especially soy. It was clear that my body was reacting to wheat and soy. And so instead of starches, I switched to sweet potatoes. Mm-hmm. And sweet potatoes became my side dish at lunch. And sometimes I would do sweet potato fries for breakfast and eat them like some amount of sweet potatoes every day for the next like 18 years or something, or at least 15 years like that. For the rest of the world who aren't health nuts like me, they're eating either French fries, potato chips, tater tots, mashed potatoes. If you go out to dinner, would you like fries or mashed with that? Would you like baked or, would you like chip? The choice is potatoes.
Yeah.
And so everybody's doing that. And then snacks, peanuts. I mean, what's a Super Bowl party without peanuts? What's a midnight snack without some peanut butter? What's an emergency? I'm dying of hunger. I'll go get the tablespoon and stick it in the peanut butter jar. Like, that's America. Or you could be into something weird like, the pickled cactus that I used to like to put on my salads. Mm-hmm. And then in the fruit world, the big one is the blackberries and the figs and the raspberries. And they're really now all over the freezer world. So you can make fruity smoothies because the non-healthy world is doing these sugary fruit smoothies that are built on berries. Mm-hmm. Rhubarb, of course, and star fruit is so toxic with oxalate and some other problems that it's truly deadly. Mm-hmm. Kiwi is not too good. And that's how I actually figured this out in my body. I went on a kiwi experiment and my arthritis came back, and that's a different story. But another thing is some of the oranges, the clementines and tangelos are very high in oxalate.
Wait, sorry, I had to jump in. I just was going through Michaela Peterson interview I did. I just put it out on social media today, and she talked about she had this reaction to oranges, and she brought it up to her doctor, her and her mom, when she was young, having all these arthritic problems, and the doctor laughed her out of the room. Like, what are you talking about? Oranges. And that could have been that oxalate.
Could have been. Yep.
Interesting. But it also brings up the point of just how lost the doctors are.
Yeah, they haven't taken an interest in this clinically. It was originally clinical folks back, in the 1800s and early 1900s who were still willing to notice this. But a lot changed in medicine when we discovered penicillin and started being able to test plasma on a routine basis. And once we knew everything we needed to know about your health was in your blood plasma, we dropped all kinds of other forms of clinical picture, like talking to the patient and thinking about these other things. Because if it doesn't show up in the blood, or if it's not an infection that I can cure with penicillin, then we're not that interested in it. In fact, some doctors today have told a friend of mine, if we don't already have a remedy for it, then you don't have it. Like, it's not a disease until we have a treatment for it. and we don't have a treatment for this oxalate deal. Really, the best treatment is prevention, and medicine has zero interest in that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I was even commenting on just the fact that doctors don't even connect diet to things, much less the oxalate, right? They don't even think about diet. But,
well, when the patient comes to them and says, I think my diet's they'll laugh you out of there. They'll scold you and shame you for your foolishness.
That happened to me at this dermatologist.
Even to you as a man. This
woman seriously thought I was crazy. She gave me the most demeaning look when I mentioned diet and skin problem. She was like, what? She's like, what are you talking about? And I just couldn't even deal with it. So I didn't bring it up. But okay.
Oh, and that just makes me think about my client base, because a tremendous number of my worst sufferers have the most awful skin things going on. And in the first 6 to 9 months on this diet is just hell. Whereas they've been in hell because they didn't know that it was oxalates causing them so much skin pain and problems. But their very skin within which they're trying to live is torturing them. And dermatologists know nothing. Now, my dermatologist, when she had some stuff she wanted to cut off to see if it was okay. I mean, I don't go often, but I decided as a good girl, I should go have it checked every, 20 years or whatever. And, I said, look, I really want these things tested for oxalate if we can possibly do it. She's like, I don't know what that is. I said, let me send. She was willing to discuss it with me. And I put together 3 pages of references on oxalate deposits in the skin. She hadn't seen any of those before. And that was like, oh, that's interesting. Well, I'll see if I can get a lab who will look at the oxalate. And she couldn't get anybody to do it. So even if they wanted to help us find out if our skin is full of oxalate or what's going on, they don't even have a pathologist to send it to find out.
Well, yeah, it's no surprise. We're just not ready to accept all this information yet. But
that's why you're assembling this sort of nutrition textbook, this
audio nutrition. Yeah, that's what I'm trying to do. Audio series. Listen from the beginning, everyone. If you're listening to this one, you have to start back at episode 1. Every guest puts a new piece in the puzzle. But I still want to get back to the science to make sure people understand that this is not just, I feel like this is happening in my body. Like, how do oxalates affect your body and the calcium and absorption and some hard numbers? I heard you talk about 70 years ago, 30% of kidney stones were calcium oxalate, and now there's 80% are calcium oxalate. So we can see this. This is like hard numbers, and it's changing. So
it's changing.
So how does it work in the body? How does oxalate and calcium, also with kidney stones? People know that vegans get kidney stones. We know if you eat too many plant foods, you get kidney stones. And a lot of doctors, they just think it's from calcium because the calcium's bound with the oxalate.
Exactly. Calcium is getting blamed for what oxalate turns calcium into a toxin in the body. But poor innocent calcium, that's really a nutrient that's supposed to keep your bones strong and keep your heart running and, make sure that there's the right charges on the right side of the membranes. And, there's pumps, and this is like part of the electricity of the body. Calcium's really important in so many metabolic ways, but suddenly calcium is the bad guy, and it's causing all this calcification of the arteries. It's causing calcification of the kidneys and kidney stones and blah, blah, blah. This is not the case that it's calcium doing it on its own. It's this tricky, nasty acid that drops protons, has a strong negative charge. Calcium and oxalate, which can drop 2 protons, have this incredible affinity. Especially calcium does have this. I don't know if calcium's the one grabbing it, but man, they're starstruck lovers that will never be torn apart once they find each other. And so the calcium that you have in your body, if you're eating oxalates that are in a soluble form, which is the form that is free to change dance partners and connect more permanently with calcium or magnesium, those soluble oxalates are the ones that easily flow around and change partners and come into the bloodstream, and it'll find calcium in the blood and take it. So now calcium's been tricked by this negative charge on the oxalate to give up its role as a useful nutrient and now become evil as a toxin. So yeah, calcium. So what my clients get from their doctor is, that's just some old calcium coming out of your eyeball. Oh, that's just some old calcium junk in your joint. Oh, that stuff in your skin, that's just some old junk, calcium. They don't have the least bit of curiosity about what form of calcium that is and where that's coming from and why it's forming there. They just have been, the lack of curiosity is splendid. Mm-hmm. And that's, unfortunately, we're complacent. We have bills to pay. We have affluence to maintain. We have a busy roster of things we should get done, and we don't have time to be curious anymore.
Okay, so talk more about the science of what
Mhm.
goes on.
Okay, so let's track the calcium or the oxalate that you're eating in your food. Now, there's other ways to get oxalate in your body. You could be using a cleaner, especially Barkeeper's Friend has oxalic acid in it, because see, oxalic acid drops its proton or its partnership with a soluble ion like sodium and potassium. It used to be called salts of lemon, potassium oxalate. Salts of lemon was a cleaner in a textile industry and other industries, important cleaner that we've used since the 1700s. So to clean leather, to clean fabric, to clean metal, to take the rust off of metal, to clean an old engine, to take the rust out of a concrete pad, you can use oxalate, oxalic acid, and pull all that nasty stuff off and clean stuff. So we've been using it in industry for a long time. And we would use it in the household in the early 1800s as well as a cleaner. And it was called salts of lemon because you could turn your lemonade even more lemony by adding a little pinch of the salts of lemon.
Mm-hmm.
And so people would actually make cheaper lemonade by having dilute lemonade, add a little oxalate to make it tart. And so that lemony tart flavor that you get in spinach is coming from the oxalic acid, and sorrel as well. Sorrel is very lemony and it's very shishy in America, and the fancy chefs will make a little sorrel kind of green sauce to put around your meat or whatever. That's because it gives that lemon flavor. That's oxalic acid doing that. So
someone died of eating too much sorrel soup.
Yes, in Barcelona. Yep.
And then
sorrel
also
soup is standard food in Europe.
Wow. And then also in India, their washing powder, people use it to commit suicide.
Yes, they do.
There's a lot of oxalic acid in it.
Right. So it's still used in cleaning products and more so in other countries than here. That's right. Yeah. While we're thinking about suicide and, the man dying from eating too much sorrel soup, it only took a few hours for him to die. The toxicologists tell us that the lethal dose of oxalate is between 3.5 grams and 30 grams. So 3.5 grams, that's 3,500 milligrams of oxalate. One smoothie is about 1 gram.
Mm-hmm.
So the lethal dose at the very lowest end is 3.5 smoothies.
Whoa.
And at the high end, it's 30 smoothies. That's a huge range. And our guy who died of the sorrel soup he basically took about the 3.5 smoothies worth of sorrel in his
Mm-hmm. But he was already
soup.
kind of metabolically damaged, I think.
Yes. He was obese, diabetic, alcoholic. And, true to form, I think that group of people who are in trouble metabolically like that and out of control with their eating and their drinking, they're deficient in a lot of nutrients. That's partly what's driving that I can't get a handle on my alcoholism. And then they have a dive into their addictions and then to recover and try to get better or to make up with God or something for that. Their guilt, they're struggling. So they go for something like the sorrel soup because they're going to recover from their hangover or just be a better person or try harder.
Healthy food, yeah.
It's the worst possible thing to give things that are high in oxalate to someone who is sick. They're the people that are down there in the 3.5 smoothie zone of that could kill them versus the 30 smoothies for the young, the bold, the people who have strong digestive tracts that are somehow able to resist allowing the oxalate to get into their bloodstream as much as his obviously did. And his system couldn't handle it. And of course, my question is, how many bowls of sorrel soup has he had his whole life? Maybe he's partially, it's not just the diabetes and alcoholism that makes him down on the low end if he could die at that level, but maybe it's the lifetime of eating sorrel soup or other attempts to eat those kind of food or just the habit of it. Some people just pick a food like buckwheat, love it, and just it becomes their daily thing they do because that's what they like to eat, not knowing that's oxalate.
Yeah.
There's this chronic side to it, but the acute and lethal effects are interesting enough. You would think a toxicologist or somebody would say, well, if that much could kill you, what if you ate just a quarter of that amount every day for the rest of your life? What does that do to you? And really, no one's done that science.
Yeah.
And so we're living that science as we do. A lot of people are at the range of about 2 to 3 grams of oxalate a day. They're right up there at a level that if you were really sick, that could really put you in the hospital and put you into renal failure, and has. There are reports of people with permanent kidney damage now on dialysis because of their smoothie cleanse program.
Yeah. And isn't kidney disease one of the fastest growing diseases?
It has been for the last 20 years.
And this is when we've been promoting all these plants.
Yes.
It's just a correlation here. We can't say for sure. It's just a little correlation. You know?
Well, there's more to how to wreck a kidney than just ruining them with oxalates, which is plenty. What we have is a world of using antibiotics for whatever, using over-the-counter drugs for, sniffles and this and that, going for prescription solutions to every ache and pain. So we're constantly flooding the kidney with these toxins. The kidney's job is to get these toxins out of your body, and we're constantly challenging it. Then we've got our commercial products that are loaded with Teflon and solvents and things that are off-gassing the foam and so on in your mattresses and sofa. The brand new baby crib has got the flame retardants and the perma press treatments in the fabric and who knows what else in the fabric, and then the plastic around the mattress and the new varnish on the wood, and of course the new paint job and new carpeting full of formaldehyde. I mean, we're living in these enclosed spaces too. Post 1970s, we try to make houses a little tighter for efficiency, and the indoor air quality has been going down as well. So you're killing off your kidneys with that, plus all this healthy food.
Mm-hmm.
It's really rough on the kidneys. And I think the kidneys deserve a little more respect. In medicine, you go to the doctor and the only organs they seem to really be concerned about is your heart and something that might get cancer, like a gonad. That's the main menu on healthcare.
Mm-hmm.
If your elbow's hurting, that's not really that important, because public health says if you don't die from it, then we won't prioritize it. Mm-hmm. But what if that elbow is a sign that you're ruining your kidneys, or you're about to get aged and decrepit, or your bones are wearing out because you're sucking calcium out of your bones every day, eating all the soluble oxalate with your nut habit, your buckwheat habit, your favorite fruit, or your soy, your beans, your whole grains.
Mm-hmm. Well, so go back to how it works in your body, because it doesn't just go straight to your kidney, right? It doesn't like travel throughout the oxalate.
Imagine that. But since the world that saw oxalates affecting the whole body kind of dropped away after we got into antibiotics and blood testing, oxalate research fell to the kidney people. So if you read the kidney research, which I've been doing for 4 years, I've looked at 3,000 articles on oxalate, and most of it's coming out of the kidney literature. To hear them speak, it's as if from your lips to your kidneys is a 2-inch travel that takes no time at all. But let's think about that. It's got to go through your mouth and esophagus and stomach, small intestine, large intestine, and rectum, and come out the other end. During that process, at any point along that path, it can get absorbed into the body. And where it's going is into the blood flow that's called hepatic circulation. So that blood is all shunted straight to the liver, because the liver, of course, has to pick up the needed nutrients and filter out the bad guys and detox some things and make sure you're not getting infections. Or the liver's making it safe because the blood is leaving the liver and going a few inches up to get the inferior vena cava to your heart. So it can be pumped to your lungs to get oxygen. So it can be pumped back to your heart so it can go to general circulation. So 100% of what you're absorbing goes into the vascular system immediately, which then delivers it to the liver, which the sinusoids in the liver is there to filter. So the cells in the liver are very open to the contents of the blood because it's the processor. But the liver has no way to disarm the oxalate whatsoever. In fact, the liver makes more oxalate and will add to it. And when it's doing that, it may not be right after a meal, or it might be, I don't know. So, because they haven't really studied that either. They don't know this, what we call endogenous production. The body produces a baseline amount as part of your metabolism. And the level of vitamin C in your diet can increase that, and other things might increase that, but they really haven't studied this. And they haven't studied it in the absence of a plant-based diet, which adds oxalate not only to your blood right after your meal, but now we have bodies that are basically storehouses for oxalate. And that's because these waves of oxalate coming out of a meal are pretty intense for the body to handle. Too much for the kidneys. The kidneys are fabulous, but they do have a limited capacity. And the heart has a limited ability to live without calcium. If you start grabbing calcium out of the blood because of this big onslaught of soluble oxalate, you're going to affect the pacemaker that's regulating the heartbeat. And this is how people like the man with the sorrel soup ultimately die, is the afibrillation, the loss of control of the heartbeat and the loss of the strength in those muscles causes them to die of a heart attack. But it was multi-organ failure where the liver, the kidneys, the heart are all filling up with crystals and the vascular system is stressing out. So during these waves of oxalate coming through, you've got at least 3 mechanisms for oxalate to get stuck in the body tissues. And there's this accumulation process. And maybe we'll get back to those mechanisms, but it's a little bit of detail for the moment.
Well, I want to hear all the science, because I'm worried that we dove into the science too late and we've been talking too high level where people might not think that you know what you're talking about. And also, just before I do that, I think this might help convince people. I'm on a vegan site, and veganhealth.org has a whole huge article on how bad oxalates are and how that's saying it's animal foods are fine, the plants are where the oxalates are. Here's digestive problems. Here's its entire encyclopedia on how bad oxalates are on a vegan site. So just saying.
Wow. Because most vegan sites are saying, yeah, oxalates are bad, but, and they have all these excuses. And there's people in the vegan world who have done, not that I'm really not in that world. I don't hang out all day, listen to other people's opinions. I spend my time in the stacks. I'm actually hitting the books at the library. I'm going up to NIH and literally at the medical library in the basement, literally studying and online and downloading articles and reading, like, where did you get that idea? Who are you referencing and who's referencing who, and walking my way all the way back. That's why I know what's been happening in the 1700s and 1800s, because I have walked my way. I've spent 4.5 years in the library and have this huge database of articles, and I'm still trying to make sense out of it as I try to piece together this puzzle, because this puzzle really angered me. My entire life is the train wreck of not knowing this information. It's so wrong that someone so well-intentioned as me and so many others who are willing to take responsibility for our health so we don't become a burden on society, so we don't become expensive and we don't become pathetic. We want to be fully self-responsible. We want to have a low healthcare bill. We don't want to be someone else's problem. We want to have a productive life. We're trying hard and we're being punished for that. And that just is about as immoral a situation as you can get. That it's so unfair that we are being fed such wrong information, and that these things happen. These things get dropped in the medical world because it's just a political world. And the institution of all the interlocking institutions of research and translation to clinical work, clinical training, medical practice, the institutions that in public health that deliver health messages and decide what should matter and what doesn't. That's really, that whole thing is skewed against good science. It's very hard to do science anymore. I mean, first of all, you have to be a very curious person. And as we've mentioned, our own doctors aren't curious as to why calcium is pouring out of our eyeballs or our skin is flaking and falling off or all red and rashy. And so the doctor's not curious, and even the research scientists aren't curious people sometimes. They're not interested in new ideas. They're comfortable with their area of investigation. And the ones who might go, it would be fun to learn more about this or that, their whole system has locked them into what they're already doing. And it's
working
really
against them.
It's
and
working
you can't
against
get funding for some of these things. I've talked to these researchers, active researchers, and they're like, we can't get funding for that.
Right.
Even if we wanted to.
That's what I did here at the University in Richmond, Virginia Commonwealth. I was a grant administrator who helped my fellow faculty write their research projects and pull together the specific aims and pull together these giant research proposals for what we call R25 mechanism. I assume it's still called that. And submit grants. And the standard, an R25 is a pretty prestigious award. Once you're getting in R25s, you're a thing in research. But you get about $350,000 a year for about 5 years, and you have to come out with something at the end. And the people who decide whether you get that grant are your competitors, are someone else's mentor. You have to style your grant so it speaks their language, it doesn't insult their work, and yet it has to be innovative and something new and fresh, and yet it has to fit these little tiny specific aims that can actually be proven. And by the time you come up with a grant that gets funded, it's kind of garbage.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I've heard that too.
I left literally feeling like I'm just facilitating what looks to me like keeping PhDs off the street. It just doesn't look like it's moving the world in the direction we need. Here we are looking at a huge health crisis. We still have a big problem with infant mortality, a big problem with addiction and alcoholism and high school dropouts and health problems and, premature babies and incubators for babies. And we have all these big problems, and the kind of grants we're able to turn out don't address any of it. And I'm like, this is almost complacency compared to the real situation on the street.
Yeah. Well, it's going to take some time. I think the tides are turning, and yeah, it's hard. It's hard to figure all this stuff out. So we can't just get too down about it. But
it's not really down. People just need to realize like research is not necessarily a magic button, and it's not something that moves quickly. So not many people take 4 years off of their career to go sit in the basement to figure out why I don't know about oxalates. Right. And that's one reason it hasn't come up very much, because there hasn't been champions with a reason for doing this work.
Well, that's you. That's why I wanted to have you on the podcast. So tell me more about all that you've learned when you did these deep dives. I know you looked at thousands of papers, right, and you're probably the leading researcher or investigator on this right now, right? Just the one who's spent it. Well,
certainly the one who's focused on the diet and, still scratching my head over why these various fields. Now, if you think about the major fields, there's medicine, there's nutrition and public health, and there's toxicology. So one of those three fields should have noticed oxalate's a problem and picked it up and run with it, but they haven't. And, I'm like, why is that? And I thought, if I could go do my life again, I would be a nutritional toxicologist and I wouldn't have oxalate poisoning. So I could have gotten my PhD and had a real career instead of all the stuff I've had to go through because of the oxalates. I had to drop out of Cornell for 4 years with foot problems and have orthopedic surgery on both feet and didn't get well. And it's a gruesome story. And my feet have not worked well for 30 years, where I couldn't go without shoes, couldn't go barefoot, couldn't stand very long, definitely couldn't run or play tennis or racquetball where you're doing a side to side, because the connective tissue in my feet weren't very good. And so, I've settled for swimming, which now I can't do, and biking, gardening, and yoga. And I love yoga. That's fine. But after I got on this diet, my feet started peeling. I had a couple nights with twinges in those old areas where the surgery was. And my feet peeled for 4 years. And now, within 6 months of this diet, I can wear heels. I can go barefoot. I can run, jump, and play. I could stand on the very ends of my toes, and I'm fine. I can do whatever I want now with my feet. But I spent 30 years with funky feet and 4 years with them peeling and looking like I had some leprosy or something. So that's motivated me too, because I'm like, it wasn't just my arthritis that was oxalate. It wasn't just my sleep problems. It wasn't just my hysterectomy. It wasn't just my back problems. It was not just my tennis elbow, but it was the feet too. It was all these things that have pulled me down and limited what my life. Whole point of studying nutrition was to have the life I wanted. And I was hamstrung starting with age 12 with back pain and arthritis. So what's interesting is that it's all there in the science. If you start digging around, it's like, oh yeah, the crystals form in the joints. Oh yeah, this oxalate ends up in the bones and the tendons and the discs of the back and are related to all these conditions and cause aberrant growth. I have something called Schmerl's nodes in my back, and that's aberrant growth that cause these Lego-like protrusions in the body of the vertebral bones. So they're sticking up into the discs. So my lower back has always been tight and frozen and unmovable, and it's getting a lot better now. But the science, so the accumulation, there's science there's so many facets to this field. And my first question was, where is all this evidence of accumulation? Susan Owens is the one that gets the science credit for that one. She's been crowdsourcing with a bunch of families with autism. She got interested in autism, and she's a sulfate researcher, and she's with the DANS group and helping them. And they somehow got in their heads that they were going to do this urinary studies of these kids and picked up on the oxalate piece and mimicked a way of evaluating the urine and looking at the oxalate level in the urine that was done by a man named Clive Solomons. This started with just a regular person suffering with a terrible condition called vulvodynia, where the vulva and the area around the vagina are in a tremendous amount of pain. And these people who get this can't sit, sleep, even walking. They can't wear underwear. I mean, they're in agony in the most sensitive part of their body. Of course, it's not good for your personal life to have your crotch burning all the time and driving you crazy. And this woman, they decided that she might have an infection in the glands that surround the opening of the vagina. So they cut those out because infections follow oxalate. Oxalate changes the pH and the conditions of the tissues, especially in that part of the body, and encourages the growth of yeast, and infectious agents and oxalate sort of travel together because you either have an infection and tissues that are then inflamed and vulnerable to oxalate accumulation, or you have oxalate running through those tissues, stressing them out, changing the pH and making it a terrain that's more comfortable for these pathogens to grow. So anyway, they took out her glands surgically and the pain came back. And so they lasered off the surface of her labia like 3 times. And she went through like 15 years of living hell. I think it was after the birth of her second child, this all got going, which is also important detail. But somehow through her network, she found this PhD guy who was willing to test her and recognize he tested every void of urine through the whole day multiple times and found these spiking patterns where oxalate in her urine was spiking horrendously, like twice a day at the same time each day. And he went on and they developed this thing called the Pain Project and studied nearly 4,000 women's urine in that way, where you study every void and watch the pattern and see these really big spikes. And they compared that with women who didn't have this condition, who didn't get those spikes. So it was clear that this group was all doing that pattern of oxalate spiking and the non-pain people weren't. So this Pain Project was very innovative because in clinical medicine and in research, they believe in 24-hour urine collections. The 24-hour urine collection flattens the spikes and makes the total day's average oxalate look kind of normal. And you don't see this pathology going on. That's still the standard practice in research in medicine because nobody wanted to believe him. And he was, in a way, kowtowed out of publishing as many articles as he should have. He ended up doing just one article, which was really the case study of this case and the research that went around this case to try to figure out what was going on. So she founded a foundation devoted to the study of how much oxalates are in what foods. And they have the very best data, we like to think, because it's all been tested in the same lab, in the same kind of way, and hopefully reported and handled correctly. So it's pretty good. And they've tested thousands of things through nonprofit donations. So it's basically a bunch of women with crotch pain who have paid to put together a decent amount of data because the field of toxicology, medicine, and nutrition has never bothered to put together a good database, which surprised me because I grew up at Cornell in school where you remember those tables we talk about, where you put together your menu plan, you go to the tables that tell you how much nutrients are in things that are kind of worthless because they don't care about bioavailability. Well, the tiny little table in the back of those books comes from USDA data. It only has 70 things on it or something when there could be 10,000 things. And I don't know, 10 or 15% of those numbers are completely wrong, completely out of the ballpark. It's terrible data. So your standard dietitian has very little data and it's not any good. And there's a lot of lists online that are terrible, including from very highfalutin institutions, dietitians working with fancy, famous kidney researchers have data
lists
that's
of oxalate, high oxalate foods. Yeah.
In food.
So where can you find
so
a good
even
one?
just that basic question, the good one is being housed now by the Susan Owens group, which is the Trying Low Oxalate group that does a Facebook page and a Yahoo group. They have taken the data that the Vulva Pain Foundation pulled together and done testing at the same lab and tried to pull that together in a spreadsheet. There's a few errors and things there, but at least it's a list that has a lot of supplements, a lot of information because honestly, if you could find a safe way to transition from a high oxalate diet without traumatizing your body and getting you into your fingers peeling like crazy and getting you into more peeing at night and more back pain and more problems, we'll talk about why that happens. All you have to do is find, arugula instead of spinach and lettuce instead of spinach and watercress instead of spinach and turnips and cauliflower instead of potatoes, and butternut squash instead of sweet potatoes, like, and some pumpkin seeds instead of all those nuts and seeds, and white pepper instead of black pepper, and less spices, and get rid of the turmeric, and quit the tea and get some herbal tea and go back to real milk. Just a few tweaks, really, if you think about it. You could cure arthritis, carpal tunnel, tennis elbow, interstitial cystitis. For some portion of all those conditions have an oxalate component to it for some people. So let's just pretend it's 28% of everyone with all those illnesses. It's strictly because of oxalates. That's tremendous.
Yeah.
And that's what we're facing. I mean, this thing continues to be shocking to me. I go to the library, and some days what I'm finding in the library just angers me. Like, it's here, people. It's here. No one pulled it together and wove it into a narrative and said, we must study this. And one of the reasons they didn't, I think, is because oxalate's really hard to study. It is a tricky molecule. It's really impossible to look into what happens in the liver and in the vascular walls and, the epithelial lining and the vascular system, what's happening to it after your spinach smoothie. It's very hard to do that kind of work. And unfortunately, it basically stopped being done, except for the fact that oxalate won't go away and it keeps showing up. It shows up in articles like the one that showed that, well, in this breast cancer study, oxalate turns breast cells into cancer cells. Well, over here, we see the crystals in the synovial joints. Over here, we see the crystals in the meninges. Over here, they got into the brain. It's interesting.
It's all over the place, but no one's brought it together. So how does that work again? So tell us again, you kind of went over how these crystals develop, but how does oxalate work in the body?
Well, okay, so there's a lot to this. You absorbing some amount, and how much you absorb depends on the whole lining of the digestive tract. Some people are prone to letting a lot of it get in, and some people somehow manage to not. And a lot of that is the condition of the intestinal tract. So if you have any kind of inflammation going on, irritable bowel syndrome, sensitivities to things where you've got allergies going on, or inflammatory bowel syndrome, anything with your gut, if you've got reflux or whatever, there's a chance that there's inflammation going on there that creates a different shaped cell in the epithelial, and the gaps between the cells are probably bigger. So it's much easier for these little ions and nanocrystals to pass between the cells and get into your blood. So guaranteed, if you've had bariatric surgery or that kind of thing, you've changed the epithelial health in the digestive tract to the point where you're probably absorbing a lot. So then it's going straight to your liver, and it's wearing out the glutathione and the natural self-protection that cells have there, probably reducing how well your body detoxes other things. We see a lot of chemical sensitivity in people with oxalate poisoning, and I think that may be one reason. It's just a constant bombardment of the liver. You're going to see throughout wherever they get to go, the oxalate crystals are causing inflammation reactions, or causing oxidative stress. It's electrically charged because, it's either an ion or a crystal. Both carry a charge. It has electrical power that interrupts the electricity of the cells themselves, because the cells depend on a charge on one side, like positive on the inside, negative on the outside kind of thing, in order to function. That's how we generate the energy of life. It's like a battery system where you've got to have a positive charge over here. And so here comes a charged molecule, and it starts depolarizing these membranes. And it only has to go near some cells. And if they don't have the power to produce a lot of self-protection with glutathione, you get your mitochondria start to die off. Once a third of the mitochondria get weak, they lower the amount of ATP they can produce. So the amount of energy your cells can produce goes down when there's oxalate around. And cells start dying, or if the cells are already inflamed or in trouble, they're not as good at defending themselves, and they become kind of sitting ducks for this oxalate to get stuck on the proteins on their membranes. Or if there's injury where those tissues literally aren't really alive anymore, and they're waiting for the immune system to carry away the shreds of dying cells, those tissues are places where the oxalate gets stuck. So if you've got infection, injury, inflammation, it's going to get stuck. So if you just had a lot of stress in your epithelial lining of your vascular system because of high insulin all the time and a lot of stress, or smoking, or what, and oxalates are coming along, they're going to increase that vascular stress. And we have a syndrome now they call endothelial distress syndrome or something. I think that combination of insulin and toxins and oxalate is really pushing that system to be in place. And that's a disaster because your vascular system is delivering nutrients and keeping the whole system going.
Mm-hmm.
So as it's traveling through the vascular system, the body's not interested in keeping oxalate in the bloodstream. And this was shown even in the very first toxicological study that looked into how you die from poisoning by Robert Christensen in 1823 was the year of presentation and publication. I assume this study took him a year to do. It's a tremendously interesting study. It's like 40 pages long and very detailed explanation of how he would put oxalate into the stomach of the dogs or the cats, mostly dogs. He used some rabbits and some cats as well, but he would put some oxalate in the stomach and then tie it off so that they couldn't vomit it out and watch how long, what it took for them to die, how the death process looked, and how quickly it happened. And he'd get in there immediately and look at the tissues and so on. It's really interesting. And what he found was you couldn't detect the oxalate in the blood. And he was doing the best he could for his era and testing it. It's still hard to test that. He was very sure that he was using pure oxalic acid and the right stuff. He's very sure the animals were dead. He's very sure he was seeing these crystals and other problems. But it was very hard to detect the oxalate in the blood. And that's because the body doesn't like oxalate in the blood and will lower it as quickly as it can, as best as it can. So there's this mechanism that's partially intentional of holding back some of that oxalate that just came in with the smoothie until the kidney's ready for it. So it's not just flying around and staying in the bloodstream. So the cells, so who knows who's assigned to this work, but somebody's holding back some of that oxalate. And it may only need to be a small amount. No one's really quantified this, or it's basically theory that was presented in the 60s that was reaffirmed in a study published in 2013 using rats and radioactive oxalate that demonstrated that of the amount that gets absorbed, about 4% of it gets hung up in the tissues of the body and doesn't make it to the kidneys. Or if it does, it's getting stuck there as well. So there's this catch and release process. So that's fundamentally the process of accumulation, but there's these basically three mechanisms that we're aware of. Anything injured is going to be a place where it gets stuck by accident. The body probably has an intentional way of trying to keep the level in the plasma low and with the intention of getting rid of it as soon as it can, which is what your body's doing to you now with your fingers. It's finally got a chance to get rid of years of spinach smoothies, right? Mm-hmm. And it's finally getting to do that. There's also a theory that I think especially applies to glands and tissues that are actively bringing materials in. And because the transporter that moves oxalate across membranes intentionally is the same transporter that moves sulfur and sulfates and iodine and bicarbonate and other things. And so it's quite possible that the glands who need to sweep in a lot of material, now glands are all kinds of tissues. There's endocrine glands, like your gonads and your thyroid gland and your pancreas and so on, right? But then there's, for example, your skin glands that produce sebum and sweat and so on. There's all kinds of glands around the eyes and, saliva glands and tear ducts and the glands around the vagina. There's like glands everywhere. The glands are busy producing stuff, whether it's producing testosterone or producing sweat. They've got to bring in raw materials so they can ship out this product all the time. Even if the product is just sweat, they're still doing work. And so my theory there is that those kinds of cells have giant shipping and receiving departments. So they tend to sweep in a lot of material, have a lot of transporters, don't have time to be too picky about it, and they end up with a lot of oxalate gets stuck in glands. That's just theory, but that's kind of the process that's going on. And we see it coming back out. Watch for yourself and see if you're noticing extra crud on your eyelashes in the morning, like a lot of heavy sleep in the morning. You might end up with watery eyes or dry eyes or itchy eyes or eye styes. That's all part of this oxalate coming out in the tissues around the eyes. You might see tartar going up and down. If the tartar is getting more on your teeth, that may be a time when oxalates are coming out. Usually people see their dental health and tartar go way down. Any place in the body where there's a lot of calcium is places where oxalate ends up getting hung up, where you've got both the vascular flow that's eager and there's plenty of bone nearby. And the face and teeth, there's a great place for that because there's lots of little thin bones in the sinuses and teeth, lots of vascularization, lots of movement there all day long. It's not that far from the heart. It doesn't take that much to get the oxalate from the heart up to the face. And for me, after I started the diet, about 3 weeks after I started, I got this facial migraine, intense pain in the face that was made it hard to fall asleep at night, especially. It lasted like 3 weeks. I was like, oh my God, it's horrible. And then it stopped. And I have never had a sinus infection since. And I had had a sinus infection every year since I was 17. Usually right around New Year's Eve, I would get this sinus infection and had to be often put on antibiotics. That's all gone now. So, and the other thing people notice is their teeth will on and off get really sensitive or start aching, and they're sure they must have an abscess and need their teeth ripped out. And some people will literally go do that. And it really doesn't need to be taken out. It really is this process of the body ready to let it go and pull it out. This is the body probably performing essentially microsurgery, getting these little micro deposits out. It's got to bring along some ability to bust up the cells. You can lay down citrate or acids, and you can destabilize these crystals and break them up into their tiny little nano crystals and ions again. Those are the sizes that irritate the cells and tell the cells, oh my gosh, we're in trouble. This is a danger signal to the cells. They start getting leaky and unhappy, and that tells the immune system they're in trouble. The immune system comes in and you get this healing response, which is inflammation, which causes a lot of pain and mayhem. Just like, I mean, to think about this, the injury was really the oxalate being there. Now the healing process is somehow getting this stuff out. That delayed pain reaction, which could be delayed 30 years, as in the case of my feet. Like it took me 30 years to get off oxalate. It took me 30 years for my feet to get happy and start peeling, but it did finally happen. The point being that what's being irritated there, the immune system, there's 2 points I want to make. One is this is real, and you know this is real because when you get a bug bite, it hurts a little when the bug bit you, and then it's like whatever. And then tomorrow or 2 days later, suddenly you have this big welt that's itching you and driving you crazy, and that happened 2 days ago. But that's not the bug bite bothering you. It's your body's attempt to get rid of the poison and to heal that area that was damaged by the bug bite, right? All that itching is your healing response, but it's really annoying and it kind of hurts, right? In a small scale. This is what's happening in the cleanout process and the immune system's coming along. The problem is when you're constantly on just a daily basis exposing your cells to oxalate, you're constantly asking your immune system to come along and fix this problem, which it will. This is called the inflammasome. The innate immunity does this and produces these responses, and it creates chronic inflammation, chronic problems that probably leads to autoimmunity issues. I think it's a major proponent, a major generator of all this autoimmune stuff going on.
Yeah. So back to Michaela Peterson. Everyone's wondering, why was she doing so well on an all meat diet? Well, it's maybe all her autoimmune problems cleared up from not having the oxalate.
No question. I felt like I was an autoimmune train wreck before I started this diet. I'm like, I must have just like 7 autoimmune problems, and most of that's all gone. And that's way before going all meat. Like I'm pretty meaty these days lately, but you can fix these things, even at least get the healing process going by just stopping the body's in this catch mode. It's in defense mode. It's being asked to hold on to oxalate every day, multiple times a day. It's perpetually in this defensive mode. So this is a metabolism state that it's chronically stuck in. It really would rather not be in. And if you change things too quickly, you can't turn this around. You can't change from that metabolism to the get rid of it metabolism very fast without it being dramatic and traumatic potentially, depending on, how I think the level of toxicity and especially in recent history, how much you've been eating in recent history can put you in a position of vulnerability to this switcheroo where now you're doing microsurgeries and the body's breaking up deposits, and basically the oxalate level in your bloodstream could get even higher than it was when you were eating these things, because now you're releasing, potentially, if there's a lot of it, releasing at the same time.
Well, so when people pass a kidney stone, that's the extreme version of this, right? It's the body finally getting rid of it.
It's one example, not necessarily, but it can be actually. Sometimes people will get kidney stones as a result of going on the low oxalate diet, but it's just one way in which oxalates can get clogged in a certain spot of the body. It's just people who get the stones aren't producing enough citrate and inhibitors of that agglomeration process where the little individual crystals all start sticking together in one big thing, and then it plugs up one of the vents, so to speak, in the kidney. And if that's plugging up the flow of fluids, then you're going to end up back up where you get infection, and it's deadly. And so people like me, I'm not prone to the stones. And so I can have all kinds of oxalate coming through my kidneys, and you see it in the toilet bowl because you can see the cloudiness. So it's unclear urine, but it's little fuzzy looking. If you don't have an infection, that's oxalate crystals coming out. And if that cloudiness looks clumpy and it's kind of little cloud of over here and little cloud over there, and it's not like even cloudiness, that is more agglomeration, more clumping with the crystals. That person is more prone to kidney stones. So if the cloudiness that's coming out post-oxalate eating is clumpy, then you really want to be protecting your kidneys. In fact, any amount of this stuff pouring through your kidneys as you're cleaning out your body is stressing the kidneys, and you want to protect them. Yeah. So citrate is one of the ways we do that. So you got the chronic part, then if you ever get away from the daily keeping the body into defense and collecting mode to, okay, we're now going to stop this process. We need to do it in a way where it doesn't trigger too vigorous a response in terms of, okay, it's winter, we can let go.
Yeah, well, okay, so that's big. We talked about seasonality. So this kind of explains some of the things where I was like, why isn't everyone, how did this work over human history? You know, we've been eating plants for quite a while, but we weren't eating them every season.
Right. So you would, and, we had practices like, you might have a fasting day, a religious holiday every Sunday or something, and you just hardly ate much.
Or for a whole month. Some religions have fasting.
For a whole month. Yeah, that's how Ramadan used to be. Now it's not really fasting. It's just eating at night. But like even the traditional ways of following our sacred holidays aren't what they once
but then
were.
all winter, we wouldn't have any oxalates.
Right. Because you'd have some ham hanging out there and some white biscuits and the occasional raisin, and it would be pretty simple over
winter. Or even
winter
before,
time.
our earlier ancestors, we just had meat.
Just pure hunting, way before the white biscuits. But even in the recent past, like 300 years ago here in Virginia, hams got us through the winter, and, some white flour and a few dried raisins and cranberries or what, it wasn't the California bounty. And, I was brought up in an era where it was so important to have vegetables, and they're so interesting and colorful, and you fill your plate, you do a big salad, and you do 2 to 3 side dishes of vegetables with dinner. I used to cook like this all the time. It's no big deal for me to run home, put together a beautiful salad, 3 vegetables and a meat, and do that. Like, that's what you're supposed to do. People did not eat like that.
No. The South America as an entire continent is an example. I went to Brazil too, and there was no vegetables in sight. It was the same thing. It was just meat and potatoes and rice. So this eating seasonally thing, it's so funny to me because I've kind of heard it as this buzzword in the health space, I eat seasonally. And it kind of made sense to me. But I'm understanding it on a new level now where there's a real purpose to it, to detoxify your body.
It's like a design.
Nature has a design.
It's like it's supposed to be that way. Like nature didn't want highways and refrigeration. We didn't need them in terms of delivery of food.
Yeah.
And the seasonality is the reason why they understood it better than we do now. We don't have a chance to see what it's like when you're not eating these things. But back when Golding Bird was looking at his urine and going, why am I so miserable? Something to do with this oxalate thing, he could see the seasonality. And so they always thought of it as a spring illness. When the rhubarb came in, that's when they would start to see all this oxalic diatheses showing up in everybody. And then it would get better in the winter, and they could see that cycle. And that's why they knew it was diet related. They were very clear that it was a dietary related condition, and something about the shift in the way we ate caused this disease. They knew that, because seasonality allowed them to see it. So the lack of seasonality blinds us to it. Yeah. And our blindness to diet's effect on our daily functioning. Me and so many of my clients and followers, you cannot tell when you're pigging out on these foods. And one woman, she narrowed her diet down to just basically almonds she'd have peanut butter, which is really high, on whole wheat toast for breakfast. Then she'd have an almond snack in the mid-morning. Then she'd have a spinach salad Then she'd have some almonds plus some peanut M&Ms for a snack. And then she'd have a dinner that usually involved either white or sweet potatoes. She ate out for dinner most nights. She narrowed her diet to that because those were the healthy foods. And she got so sick. Her life had fallen apart. She could hardly go in a store.
Wow.
And in the meantime, they took out her gallbladder, and she ended up eventually getting kidney stones and was in the emergency room twice. And it was horrible. She was having to carry a diaper bag. I mean, and then she talked to me. She came over here. We talked. And 3 days later, I got a text from her and she said, this is amazing, and then a year later, her elbows just started killing her. And she quit her job because she couldn't even carry anything. And she went through over a year of intense elbow pain and started wearing a wrist brace, and her teeth started hurting. And all these things have, I think, moved on. But the more we delay the recognition of this progressive toxicity, the more the severity. So we have a combination of we're getting more toxic and more deficient in B vitamins and minerals as this persists. It's all going on in silence. And then even when it's not silent, we can't recognize the connection with what we're eating. I couldn't tell. After I learned about oxalates, I went on and off the sweet potatoes and I could not tell the difference. I'm like, well, sweet potatoes aren't the one. Maybe there's a different kind of oxalate in sweet potatoes. Like I could not see it. And I was like, I got all these other problems, so I'm not going to worry about oxalate. So in the meantime, we drift back to the whatever our oxalate foods that we can't give up. And that's because no one has made this real, and we haven't found a way to diagnose it and recognize it.
Well, how do vegans live long, healthy lives sometimes then?
Well, I don't know, because I stopped being part of that world 20 years ago. I don't hang out with them. I don't listen to them. I don't talk to them. Although, I'm sure I know friends who are vegans, and certainly at my yoga studio. Some of them look great, although I think I look a lot better.
Yeah. Well, maybe they are reading these vegan health warnings about oxalates. So there's plenty of fruits and vegetables that have lower oxalates. So, but I'm just,
yes, there's absolutely, you do not have to give up your anything. I mean, honestly, people stick with their eating out and their sugar and their whatever. If they make just the oxalate change, you can see tremendous things happen in your system. And it's a great way to start because you're aware that you're working on oxalate. You can do it in a deliberate way, hopefully an informed way that's not rapid and abrupt and traumatic on the body. And then by then you're feeling better and you're encouraged that your efforts will pay off, and you might start to go more keto and get away from the sugar, get over your soda habit, or eat less desserts, and then really think, meat's maybe not so bad, and start upping your portions of meat and working your way over. And what I would like to know is how soon can we get to a very meat intense diet if you want that? Because I think that's sort of a vitamin pill. I certainly think liver's a vitamin pill, and oxalates put you in a great need for minerals and for B vitamins. Mm-hmm. And when is it going to be? This is a whole question. We don't have any science behind how do you transition from oxalate toxicity to a diet that allows you to continue to heal over the next 4 to 10 years and doesn't encourage this process of the microsurgery, getting the oxalates out at a level that's ruining your life in the process. Because it can be very difficult for the first couple years as the body's cleaning this out. You can be having a lot of problems, like your skin is peeling off. That's not so bad if it doesn't ruin your ability to type, right, or sleep.
Yeah, so the problem is a lot of these foods, like the almond flour, like in the keto community, everyone relies on almond flour, but it's probably one of the worst things.
Probably the worst invention in modern history. Oh. I think it's a disaster.
And so a lot of these that are supposedly are even in the low carb community are not. So we already listed those foods. So another thing before we go, I wanted to bring up is some animals can handle these oxalates because I guess they have different digestive tracts, different whole systems. But even though I think you mentioned that sheep, if certain animals who are made to eat plants get stuck in certain places with high oxalate feed, they can die.
Yes, and do. It's all the ruminants somebody's done an estimate of like which animals tolerate how much oxalate relative to each other. And I can't pull that up from my memory, but I have at least 5 or 6 articles about how, there's this noxious weed in the northern Midwest or something in rangelands that is super high in oxalate. It's sort of the sorrel soup for sheep, and especially for sheep, but all of them, the goats, the deer, the cattle, quite toxic for them too. I mean, they have rumens where the bacteria are the ones who have to handle all the cellulose and stuff in the grass, but they get into some high oxalate areas. And apparently the animals are either, I think the browsing and the forage available to them is so limited, they're sort of just have to eat because there's so little calories and energy in these greens they're eating. They have to keep eating something. So I think the animals, if they had a choice, would normally browse around them a bit and kind of limit their exposure to it. And so it's not real common, but it's when they get stuck in an area where there's nothing else to eat. And, when you're hungry, you eat.
Yeah, wow. Well, any other kind of numbers? I think there's one more number that I wrote down is that 80% of people over some age have calcium oxalate in their thyroid.
50, age 50. 80, I think it's 85% out of a couple of studies. It's difference. One study found something higher. One said 79%, one said 85%, but maybe it's 79 of everybody and 85% for over 50, but that's like normal. So you're saying the thyroid gland, which is in big trouble these days, thyroid all over blog land is what to do about your thyroid. And yet we're filling up with oxalate crystals. This is a gland that apparently gets, who knows why it's there. They haven't studied it enough to know, but to me, that says high oxalate foods. And it's so normal that even in the last 20 years, like by the time you're old, you're full of oxalate in your thyroid gland. And that was one problem I had. I had a big lumpy thyroid. And when I was working at the university, the last post I had, and my primary care doctor said, he sent me for sonograms and all of that. And all of that went away on the low oxalate diet. And my thyroid function got better. And then it seemed to get a little low again when I went zero carbs for a while, and then, but it's fine. It's I'm still taking a tiny bit of Armour thyroid to support it, but it's like a quarter of a grain. It's like tiny. Whereas before I was like on a whole grain. So I'm taking about a quarter of the dose I was when it was before I went low oxalate.
Well, that's great. And
others see that same thing too.
Yeah.
And neurotoxicity, that's the big one. That's the one it really cleans up more quickly than say the elbow joint that takes a while to get around to. The sleep problems that people get into. That was me, brain arousing 29 times an hour, couldn't function. That went away in like 10 days. I could start to read again and my brain started coming back online. All kinds of neurotoxicity, whether it's mood issues or pain issues or coordination. You'll see this actually, Brian, for yourself. This is one way you can tell that you're going through a day when your body's moving oxalate. You'll be less coordinated. You'll drop stuff. You'll misjudge. When you put down a glass or a cup on a table, you might set it on the edge instead of actually on the table because you misjudged it, and frustrate yourself all day because you dropped your keys and you dropped your this and your that. That kind of klutzy stuff, that's neurotoxicity happening because oxalates are moving around. And so it's a good sign. It's like, oh, okay, my system's struggling, got cloudy urine, I need a nap, I'm kind of grumpy. It's not really me. It's me in healing mode. So I call this whole thing metabolic PTSD. This oxalate exposure constantly is causing changes in your metabolism, literally. It's changing your epigenome. It's changing how well your cells can handle calories. It's changing how your body's functioning. It's having to focus on this toxicity stuff. And there is this long tail of issues that can hang on as your body's cleaning out. And some of them, like damage to the gut, in the combination of the antibiotics and the microbiome changes and the vaccines that are stressing out the immune system and also literally changing our metabolism, and the constant access to high carbs and high insulin levels. Plus we've got the solvents, the pesticides, the standard over-the-counter and prescription drug use that's so normal. Our systems, by the time you get to be my age and you're 55 years old, there is a tale of metabolic derangement. I don't know how much we can really be the awesome people we were meant to be.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm glad that I think we're finding the way now, and I'm glad I found you and started making these changes so I don't keep going down that path. And luckily,
please stay in touch with me because questions will come up if you did do a long period.
I don't think it was that
the green
bad.
smoothies.
And I stopped those years ago.
Good.
I stopped those years ago.
Good.
It was just, I think it's not too bad. So
Plus you're young.
yeah.
Perfect.
So I just want to let everyone know where to find you. And a lot of this stuff is in the literature, and I have tons of studies. Where can people even find these studies? Do you have a list of these studies? Where can they find you?
I haven't really put out a list. You can start with just that article that you referenced earlier, the lost seasonality and overconsumption of plants puts us at risk for oxalate toxicity. If you start reading some of those articles, that would be a great place to start. And then, if there's something in particular that you're interested in, I might have, but I'm still sifting through it all and still making sense of what it all means if you make connections. But if someone is a true researcher and wants my Zotero database, I have this huge database of tagged articles, and I've manually tagged things and still need to maybe make that better. But we have some, I think, basis in some of the digging I've done to write some good grants if somebody wanted to fund them, or just forget all that hard work, get someone who just has some money and let's get something done. I think the short term, what we need is some crowdsourcing. I think the world that is looking at keto, carnivore, and ancestral health, that circle needs to be more oxalate aware so that we can start crowdsourcing. Well, what does it mean if you as an individual are high oxalate? We should all know how to warn you about how to do this transition. We should not over encourage our friends who are vegans or on green smoothies to jump straight to carnivore. That could be metabolically so traumatic and put them in serious trouble because they're fragile. So we need to be more aware of this issue in order to safely migrate away from these dietary concepts that are pulling us down. And this is all uncharted territory. It is the Wild West, and we need to do it together. Susan Owens is in on this with us. She's very much a researcher. She's interested in metabolic pathways and looking at them through organic acid tests. She'd, I'm sure, be thrilled to compare a pre-carnivore diet or a pre-keto diet to a post-keto or a post-carnivore diet and see what it's telling us about the metabolism of the body and what we can learn in terms of how we can parse out different types of vulnerabilities and different metabolic needs that people might have as individuals, so we can support them in re-nourish things and bringing us back to a state of not being so depleted. And if we get all the engines working again as they should in the cells, maybe this process of cleaning up the oxalate is less stressful on the body and the person living in the body.
I hope so. Let's do it. All right. What's your website?
SallyKNorton.com.
And you're on Twitter?
I'm sort of on Twitter. I'm trying to be, I think these days, my thing is becoming Instagram. Should be pretty easy to reach me there. I'm trying to become more out there with social media. When you're helping people and trying to figure out how to help them and doing the research and working on a book and have a proposal that I need to be shopping around and lots of other things I'm doing. So it's easy to kind of ignore social media, but I'm available for people. I'm hoping to put out more information on Instagram. I'm working on maybe a CME course. The people that work with me as clients, I'm going to be working on a virtual support group. I know Sean's doing something with supporting ex-vegans and so on. So yeah, right. So he's, gone after that. Oh, vegans, you have to stop fooling yourselves.
Yeah.
You need some meat, and is offering some way for them to get together as, recovering vegans. And so there might be a way to tap in there.
All right.
Yeah. And this process of what we're doing here is a big part of my mission to just educate. And if people want to offer suggestions about how to move this forward, I'm all ears.
Awesome. Well, reach out on our website, SallyKNorton.com. And
one tip, Brian, I might offer for folks is if you want to spend 3 minutes on my website, go to the results page and look for the video that says support group. And it's 3 minutes, and you'll meet some of the folks who talk about how their sciatica went away. Oxalate makes a big difference on their pain. I went from barely being able to walk to being able to exercise. And, it's just give you a sense of that. I think that's 3 minutes well spent. And there's lots of information there on the site.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, hear it straight from the people. Those personal stories really help hit home and make you realize these things.
Well, thank you for sharing your story today, Brian. I didn't realize you were just really recently zero oxalate diet.
Yeah, I didn't even
already seeing it.
Yeah, I mean, luckily I was never too high oxalate recently, but I do think I did some damage, and I think I'm on the right path now. So thank you so much, and
dash me an update as you get some weird things happening.
Yeah, let's keep in touch.
Make a little diary note on an email, flash it over to me, and I'll be fascinated to see that.
All right, thanks so much, Sally.
Thank you, Brian. Be well.
All right. Thanks for listening, everyone. Don't forget to support me on Patreon. You can just search for Peak Human or click through the show notes. You can still get a copy of the film and the other perks on Indiegogo. Also, you can support me by just clicking on that 5-star icon in the Apple Podcast app. Or 1 star, whatever you think is fair. I'll see you next time. Unless you're one of the 1-star people, then I probably won't.